All right, okay, we're on now. So I see that India has 3 interrelated challenges for its railway. Number 1, the first challenge is that rail service is losing traffic and market share to road. After decades of growth, both freight and passenger traffic are down, despite India having the fastest growing economy in the world. The second challenge is capacity. Traffic has grown much faster than infrastructure capacity and is constrained in key corridors. This affects Indian Railways' ability to offer competitive services. The third challenge is finances. Historically, railway revenues have covered railway operating costs and contributed to about a third of capital investment, but balancing the budget is increasingly difficult. Moreover, passenger losses are huge and put a big burden on freight, whose high tariffs then reduce its competitiveness. So Indian Railways is at a crossroads. If these issues are not addressed, it risks becoming trapped in a vicious cycle of deteriorating finances, underinvestment, capacity bottlenecks, and declining rail share. So today I'd like to dig deeper into these issues, one level, and based on that, highlight some of the governance reforms international experience would suggest to put Indian Railways instead on a virtuous cycle of growth, investment, and financial sustainability. Let's look first at freight service. Coal, which accounts for over 40% of Indian Railways' freight volume and near half of its freight revenue, is down. This is probably not a temporary blip. It's the result of structural changes in the economy, such as coal from new mines in Orissa displacing imported coal. So this traffic is not likely to come back, and the gap needs to be filled with new traffic. The good news is that India has lots of other traffic that could be carried by rail. Our freight logistics model shows that rail carries only a fraction of the traffic that in other countries would move by rail. And the railways in my country, the United States, were similarly dependent on coal a few years ago, but they were able to develop other lines of business, which, as you can see for 2 of the major railways in the US, are now bigger revenues producers than coal. This was able to happen because the railways were freed to change how they worked. They went from bureaucratic, government-focused train producers, the kind of guys that would expect the customer to adapt their logistics system to the railway, to customer-friendly transport providers who adapted the rail service to the customer needs. This required a big change in culture, as well as competitive prices, tailored services, targeted investments, all wrapped up in long-term contracts with service guarantees. India could attract this kind of non-coal traffic too. It's there to be moved, but it requires commercial management, which is much easier to deliver in a company structure than through a ministry. And it requires that the cross-subsidy from freight to passenger services be reduced so freight can charge competitive prices. If India continues to impose the cost of passenger services on rail freight, it condemns India to a high carbon, high logistics cost, high road congestion future. I don't have the comparable data to be able to talk about potential growth in rail passenger markets, although I firmly believe it's there. But I do have some data about why passenger services require so much subsidy. Now, I've heard people say that it's because Indian Railways is overstaffed, and I want to tell you that is not supported by the facts. If we look at Indian Railways staff productivity, it stacks up pretty well against other passenger railways. It's about 70% of the productivity of China Railway and more than twice the productivity of France or Germany. The issue is in ticket revenues. Indian Railways ticket revenues are way lower than in other countries. Indian Railways' revenue per passenger kilometer is less than 1/5 of that in China, while the average salary is about the same. So what does international experience suggest could be done to address this issue? Well, given how low the rates are, there does appear to be some room to raise rates. It's something to consider and study. Rates could be indexed to cost and inflation. This is something I just heard MTR in Hong Kong discuss a couple days ago. It's possible to enlist local support for local services. Russian Railway, for example, has put its suburban services into joint ventures with municipalities, so they share in supporting the service. China Railway develops high-speed rail infrastructure through joint ventures with the provincial governments, again, getting the local governments to support the investments. In many countries, you can support loss-making social services through government-funded public service contracts. Many countries do this. And finally, it's possible to leverage passenger assets and footfall through advertising and developing station real estate. That cannot substitute for the other sources of revenue, but it can be an excellent supplement. Went too far. I've lost my infrastructure one. Okay. On infrastructure, key corridors in the Golden Quadrilateral are saturated with trains. The dedicated freight corridors being built with World Bank and JICA support are part of the answer to this, but much more needs to be done. Ministry of Railways has developed the concept of a Railways of India Development Fund to raise financing from the private sector for commercially viable infrastructure. But as the Railway Fund exercise has demonstrated, financing depends on funding. The cash flows from freight, passenger, and government support have to be sufficient to pay back the financing that allows investments in these services. So addressing the low revenues from passenger service and growing the profitable freight traffic are key to being able to finance the expansion in infrastructure that's needed. So based on this analysis of the issues, if I had to lay out the top 3 governance changes that international experience would suggest to address the Indian Railway challenges, they would be the following. Number 1, turn Indian Railways into a state-owned enterprise with financially separate passenger and freight units, acting under the mandate and with sufficient independence to operate commercially. Every major railway in the world, except India, is a company. Russia, China, and many others have made this change to enable their railway to be more commercial and market-oriented. And when I raise this issue, which I know is controversial in India, I'd also like to emphasize the importance of the mandate and the independence to operate commercially. Without this, corporatization is just moving the boxes around. Number 2 would be to encourage market pricing and contracting for freight services. Without services tailored to specific customers, the railways cannot compete with trucks and expand profitable services that it needs for its financial help. And third would be to build the revenue sources for passenger service so that passenger service has the funding to support needed investment and service improvements. Now, I know these simple-sounding ideas are not easy to implement, but the market is there. And with all the smart people in Indian Railways and right here in this room, I'm sure you can figure out how to do this and put Indian Railways back on a virtuous cycle of growth, investment, and financial sustainability. Thank you.